Hi, everybody. It's Mrs. Westmoreland, and I'm going to be talking about some of the um, modifications or adjustments to the models that help us understand covalently bonded molecules with Lewis structures and VSEPR theory. So when we're examining these molecules and thinking about the location of the valence electrons in bonds, we have to remember that most of the data that we have is very indirect evidence, right? We can't actually measure where the electrons are. And so a lot of this is conclusions made from indirect evidence. So the things that actually can be measured are the bond length, the bond energy, the bond angles. And so those bond properties sort of form the basis of our conclusions about Lewis structures and VSEPR theory. So one of the things that's already come up before is something called bond order, where we assign a bond order to a bond based on its length and its energy. And so we use the bond order of 1 for a single bond, a bond order of 2 for a double bond, and a bond order of 3 for a triple bond. So we know that a molecule is composed of atoms that are bound together by sharing pairs of electrons using the atomic orbitals of the bound atoms. And so this is the basis of our Lewis diagrams, our VSEPR theory, and it essentially assumes in the localized electron model that bonded electrons are derived from the overlap of the atomic orbitals that we talk about in our electron configurations. So here's an example of what I mean by the overlap of atomic orbitals to make a covalent bond. So if we can visualize a spherical 1s orbital, which contains one electron in an unbonded hydrogen atom, when those two hydrogen atoms bond to create a diatomic hydrogen molecule, those 1s orbitals are going to overlap, and the electron pair is going to reside mostly in between the two nuclei of those atoms in terms of our probability of finding those electrons. So it's as if those spherical 1s orbitals overlapped to create the bond. Here's another example of an overlap of atomic orbitals to create a bond, a covalent bond. And so the electron configuration of fluorine is 1s2, 2s2, 2p5. And so within those three kind of propeller-shaped orbitals of fluorine, there's a pair in the first box or orbital and a pair in the second box or orbital, and then there's a single electron in the third box or orbital. And these three propeller-shaped p orbitals are arranged 90 degrees from one another in space. And so we can overlap two of those propeller-shaped orbitals to create the fluorine diatomic molecule, where, again, the most likely, most probable place of finding that pair of electrons is in between the nuclei of the two bonded atoms. And here's another example of the overlap of atomic orbitals creating the covalent bond. This time we have the 1s electron of a hydrogen atom overlapping with the unpaired 3p electron of a chlorine atom to create a covalent bond where the electrons are found most likely in between the two nuclei of the hydrogen and the chlorine. So that relatively simplistic image of the atomic orbitals overlapping to become the covalently bonded orbitals begins to fall apart in some more complicated molecules. And so methane, or CH4, is a great example of that. So if we think about the ground state electron configuration of carbon, 1s2, 2s2, 2p2, those two unpaired electrons in the 2p orbital don't really explain the way we can get 4 single covalent bonds with the 4 hydrogen atoms in the Lewis dot structure of this molecule. So one way we could begin to solve that problem is by thinking about the carbon being in an excited state electron configuration, where we now have 1 electron in the 2s orbitals and 3 electrons, each unpaired in one of the 3 2p orbitals. So that's better, but it's still not great, because when we actually measure the length and energy and bond angle of the methane molecule, all 4 of those bonds are equivalent in length and strength, and they repel one another equally in space. And so having an electron in the 2s and 3 electrons in the 2p doesn't really help us understand how they all became equal, because the energy of a 2s electron is different than the energy of a 2p electron. So the model needs to be modified, and the modification we make is called hybridization. And so hybridization is used to describe the arrangement of electrons around a central atom in a covalently bonded molecule. And so what it means is simply that the 4 orbitals, 2s and 3 from 2p, have been sort of blended together to create 4 equivalent orbitals that we refer to as an sp3 hybrid orbital. So now we can think of all 4 of those electrons being able to make those bonds of equal length and equal energy and of equal repulsive force according to the Vesper theory. So here is an image of how the 4 atomic orbitals of the valence shell of carbon, the 2s, and the 3 2p orbitals could be blended or hybridized into 4 equivalent orbitals that would arrange themselves in the tetrahedral arrangement. So then our orbital picture of methane would then involve the overlap not of the individual s and p orbitals, but of these hybrid orbitals to create the tetrahedral arrangement when they created the overlap with the 1s electron of the hydrogens. So this relates to our Vesper theory, where we look at the bonding and the non-bonding domains. And so in this case, all 4 of these molecules, methane, ammonia, and water, would all have sp3 hybrid orbitals. So they would all have a tetrahedral arrangement of their electron pairs around the central atom. The difference being that in ammonia, we have 3 bonding and 1 non-bonding, making the trigonal pyramidal shape. And in water, we have 2 non-bonding and 2 bonding, which creates the bent shape. But all 4 are based on the tetrahedral electron arrangement and the sp3 hybrid. This also helps explain the bond angles decreasing from methane to ammonia to water, because the non-bonding pairs of electrons will have a greater repulsive force than the bonded pairs of electrons. And so the bond angle in ammonia will be slightly smaller than that of methane, and the bond angle of water is even a little smaller than that, because those non-bonded pairs of electrons push the bonded pairs a little bit closer together than they would be if they were all four equivalent bonds. So there are two other types of hybridization in addition to sp3, which is associated with tetrahedral geometry. There's sp2, in which one s orbital and two p orbitals are hybridized to make three equivalent orbitals that arrange themselves in shape in a trigonal planar shape. And what that sp2 hybrid orbital allows for is both a head-on overlap, which we call a sigma bond, but also there is one of the p orbitals that is not part of the hybrid orbital. And now that p orbital will be available to make a different kind of bond, a sideways overlap, which is known as a pi bond. And that's where we're going to get our double and our triple bonds. So this image looks a little bit daunting at first, but let me break it down for you. So the Lewis diagram of ethene, C2H4, would have a double bond between two carbon atoms, and then two hydrogen atoms also attached to each one of those carbons. And so if we examine the carbons and think about our bonding domains, each carbon is surrounded by three bonding domains: the single bond to the hydrogen, another single bond to the hydrogen, and then the double bond to the carbon. So those three domains are going to repel one another in space to be as far apart as possible, and that's going to be associated with the trigonal planar electron geometry, which is also associated with the sp2 hybridization. So the number of bonding domains, or the number of domains, corresponds to the number of orbitals that have been blended or hybridized. So those hybrid orbitals are represented in blue here. And so you can see the sigma bond between the two carbon atoms, the head-on overlap of the blue hybrid orbitals. There's also sigma bonds between the blue hybrid orbitals of the carbon and the red 1s orbitals of the hydrogen. But then we also have this pi bond where the unhybridized p orbital of both of the carbon atoms is available to create that double bond. So each double bond is made up of a sigma bond and a pi bond, whereas single bonds are only sigma bonds. So in this particular molecule, we would have a total of 5 sigma and 1 pi.